start up. As you're coming in, if you'd like to, you can place your name and city in the chat. This series of webinars, we have a three-part series, and we're in the last part of the series, is part of a series on starting a new faith community. And it is powered by the V3 movement. If you don't know what the V3 movement is, I'll give you just a quick little update on what that is. The V3 movement is a learning cohort that has been going on for about 10 years. And we've trained a little over 500 women and men in how to start faith communities that are oriented around four particular things: locally rooted presence, boundary crossing mission, life-forming discipleship, and tight-knit community. It's an 8-month training system where you are partnered up with a coach and a group of 6 to 8 people to help you start your idea of what it means to be the people of God in your particular place. We use some patented curriculum and a really transformational coaching approach. And we also start out with an on-site intensive together. And then those 8 months are online. If you're interested, right now we're taking applications for the V3 cohort, and it starts up in the end of August. And we're taking applications now. And if you are looking for support and help and training and people that care about being the church outside the walls, love for you to consider joining us. You can also find that out. I think we put that in the chat, but if you go to the v3movement.org, you can also schedule a little chat if you'd like 45 minutes to consult with someone and to see if V3 is a fit for your dreams. Love to do that for you as well. So today we are going to be talking with my good friend Tim. And Tim has a long list of credentials. I won't go through all of them, but Tim wrote one of my favorite books, co-authored a book called The New Parish, which is really talking about the neighborhood and the church coming together. And then he recently wrote Everywhere You Look, which is a really succinct and sharp exploration of what God is doing in the neighborhood, and I recommend that to you. That book came out a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah.
You're due for a new one, Tim.
It's kind of that time, isn't it? Yeah, it was a couple of years
It
ago.
is.
It's still new
Yes.
though to me.
I know. It's not an old book in concept. It's new and fresh and is relevant right now. And so I wrote those two books and then co-founded the Parish Collective, and is really an organization that is helping people have imagination for their neighborhood. And I met Tim years ago, probably 10 years ago, at the Inhabit Conference, which is a conference he co-founded as well. And it's a place that brought people together to dream and explore and think about what God is doing in the neighborhood. So Tim is obsessed with the goodness and beauty of what can happen in the neighborhood. So that's why Tim is on today. We're going to talk about that, but we're also going to bring together my passion for church planning and look at the convergence of the two. So Tim Soerens, thanks for coming on. And I'm Dan White Jr., wrote a couple books, helped lead the V3 movement, and hopefully a decent guy. So Tim, let's talk a little bit about the framing of the neighborhood, and let's set this up a little bit about what we're talking about. Can you start us out, Tim?
Sure. Well, a couple things. First of all, what a
Yeah.
joy it is to be with you, Dan. Second of all, what a gift it is to get to meet all these wonderful folks who are gathered here.
Mhm.
Um, I'll say right off the bat, we'll talk about it later, but I've been a long time both like a fan and champion of V3.
Mhm.
Within kind of our broader work with the Parish Collective, it's kind of our
Mhm.
go-to resource for anyone that's discerning planning a church. So if you are thinking
Mhm.
about it, seriously, like sign up for those 45-minute slots and dig into it. Um, well, there's two kind of big ideas that I might propose
Yeah.
to get us going. And they're not they're not new ideas. They're not even my ideas, but I do feel like there are two ideas that fit together really well. The first one is this, and I'm going to say it,
Okay.
and oddly enough, given all the ecclesial or churchy and even cultural tumult that a lot of us have been through in the last number of years, it feels weird to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's a phrase that used to be spoken by a very well known megachurch pastor, which has been really influential to me. And that phrase is that the church is the hope of the world. And I don't hear that much anymore. Um, Certainly with like confidence. But friends, where I guess I'd want to begin is I still believe that's true. Not because we have
Mm.
it all together, not because the church has not caused all kinds of harm in all kinds of places, but because, as the Apostle Paul says in Corinthians, we are the body of Christ, and we must never forget this. And if that is true,
Mm.
then that is, yeah, who we are as the body of Christ, that is the hope of the world. I really believe that.
Mhm.
And the implications for that are incredible. I feel like in a lot of the circles that I'm in these days, um, like I said, for lots of good reasons, kind of championing the cause of the local church doesn't feel very certainly cool. Not that that matters at all, but just like in a
Mhm.
lot of the circles that I'm in, like even saying that phrase feels like, oh, tone deaf or whatever. And we can talk about that. And maybe it does to some of you, and let's get into it for sure as we have a conversation. But um, I still believe it. And we can get into that more. And then there's another phrase that I feel like goes together with that phrase, and that is that the neighborhood or the parish, and we could talk about how we define this, is the unit of change. Um,
Mm.
Dan mentioned that book, Everywhere You Look. One of the chapter titles is called "The Parish is the Unit of Change," and I'm borrowing it actually from years ago. It's kind of embarrassing, but the New York Times columnist David Brooks wrote a column, which you can still Google. You can go find it, called "The Neighborhood is the Unit of Change," and I I read that. I like saw it online, and just like I didn't even read the piece, and I started like sending it to everyone I know, like posting it everywhere. It is a great piece, but I really feel like um, all kinds of denominations, foundations, all kinds of different nonprofits have different what we call theories of change.
Mm.
A lot of really great things to talk about there, but the thing that I have landed on for years now is that the neighborhood, or kind of the broader ecosystem of living, working, playing actual real lives with real systems, the more
Mm.
that we as the church can be invested in
Yeah.
neighborhoods or parishes, place to place to place, and see that as a unit of change, as the place where we imagine what God is doing. We discern the dreams of God. We're praying for the shalom of God in that place. Because we are created, because we are limited, because we all live in real places, when you ask the questions of what God is longing for, what is God is dreaming for,
Mm.
um, and you allow for those imaginations, those sacred imaginations, to find root in real places with real people and real stories, real systems, albeit they're interconnected. It's an
Yeah.
entirely different pathway than just
Mm.
talking about shalom cosmically or nationally or even ideologically. Like, of course, we believe that God wants to renew and restore and reconcile and liberate everything. I believe that.
Mm. Mhm.
But when you take that frame and walk around your neighborhood,
Mm.
you begin to see real gaps. You see real assets. You see real people. And as you get to know and love people, you're like, that ache, that pang is an
Mhm.
invitation. And that's why these two things are really interesting for me anyway, Dan, because it's not a It's not a church growth strategy per se.
Sure.
Um, Maybe in the long tail it is, but I feel like the neighborhood or the parish is not so much a new technique. It is a dare. It's an invitation into reality. It's
Mm,
a, in some ways, it's a testing of our faith in a healthy and whole way.
mm,
And why, to come back to it, I still feel passionate about the local church is even in most of the places that where most of us are, even if you think of like the couple of percentage points, say 3%, 4%, 5% of practicing Christians in that neighborhood, if they could get together and
mm,
discern what God is up to, and they could grow in trust together, and they could see that place in their life together as deeply formative to
yes.
their own individual and collective life, I just feel like that is the thing that most of our neighbors are asking for, calling off for. And
Sure.
there isn't anything, friends, that I found, or I would give my life to that, like the local church. There just isn't.
Mm, yes.
Um, I, I'm not in a place, I'll pause here and then we can react to this, Dan. Push back
Yeah.
and whatever you want. But uh, I'm not in a, I know there's lots of people who have had kind of different moments of either doubt or deconstruction. And I think that's really healthy. I'm not in that place right now. Maybe you can tell. But even if I was, and frankly, maybe this is almost an overly dramatic statement, but even if I was, and even if I couldn't, like I decided I was no longer going to follow Jesus, or I couldn't handle the Jesus thing, or I couldn't stomach the idea of resurrection or whatever, but I still wanted to figure out some kind of like integrated ecological networked understanding for the healing of the world. I really couldn't imagine anything outside of small teams in real places at the neighborhood level,
Mm,
working for the common good and connected across places.
mm,
That would still be
understanding.
what I would give my life to. Now,
Yes.
I do actually happen to believe that God is at work. I do believe in the resurrection, so don't get me wrong. But you look at where our cultures in most of the West anyway are cracking, whether
Yes.
and falling apart on, I mean, economically, environmentally, our education systems, civically, um, not least spiritually, relationally, et cetera, et cetera. We need some kind of integrative, holistic pathway to imagine how
Yes.
we can
Yes.
truly be the church, not just go to church.
Right.
And that's what I'm really passionate about.
It's good to. Well, I don't know if you intended to inspire, but I'm really moved by I'm really moved by that, Tim, and share a lot of that um, conviction and commitment to the small unit of, but not small in power, but small, probably by many people's standards, what God is doing in a local place. I just want to encourage people, if you have questions, we'll do a little Q&A at the end of this. You can put your questions in the Q&A function. I think it's in the corner of your screen, or maybe it's at the bottom. Um, but so Tim, I want to kind of I want to work through some of the minutia of that a little bit. So when you say neighborhood,
Yeah.
what do you mean? So like that can be a cliche or a very, very broad term. What do you mean
Mm-hmm.
by neighborhood?
I appreciate that question, Dan, because I actually prefer
Hmm.
the word parish.
Okay.
And the reason for that is in a urban context, in a kind of city regional level, usually the word parish and neighborhood are pretty much synonymous.
Sure.
But I love the word parish because um, one, it has kind of like a religious history and sensibility and
Sure.
telos, but also uh, part of why me and two dear friends wrote the new parish is to kind of like say, no, this is an idea, this is a word that we think it could be recovered
Mm,
because how we define it, at least just to play with right now, is a geographic area that is large enough to live a lot of your life. So, live, work, play, not purely residential. That's kind of a key, but small enough to be known as a character within the story of that place. So, to be a character in a city the size of Chicago or Toronto or even like Halifax and where some of the folks are, I don't know about Arnhem, but um, it's just too big. You couldn't be known. You can participate, of course, and you're a citizen, and all, but you can't really be known that well across a city. But at a neighborhood or parish level, you could. Now, a lot of us probably on this call now or listening in later are also part of suburban and rural communities. And that's where the word neighborhood oftentimes kind of like bends and breaks, where parish doesn't because it's a bit more elastic. So most suburbs, I would say, geographically, I would consider them a parish. Usually they have
mm,
a high school, maybe two, one kind of town center. Usually there's one kind of civic entity, whether it's a mayor or a town council. Um, but it's a living ecosystem. Most
mm,
suburbs are, and there's a whole conversation between suburbs and cities and how they're changing and sloshing back and forth with gentrification and mobility and things like that. But then in
yes.
rural communities, a parish might be 50, 60, 100 square miles with a common center, like maybe it's a
Yes.
granary or a pub, couple pubs or whatever. Um, and discerning what faithful presence looks like and how to be the church in that parish across
Mm,
those kind of those big three geographic areas, I think is really interesting. And of course, I see them as interdependent and interconnected,
mm,
not
yes.
just environmentally, but culturally and ecclesially.
Tim, do you encourage um, leaders and planters to get very clear about what their parish is when it comes to some of the things that you were listing as school, mayor, parks, you know, so kind of get teasing
Mhm.
down concretely what their parish actually is. Do you?
Yeah, I do, because the dream, I think, for most of us is not just to get people to come to our church building or our new
Right.
service. It's for us to craft a way of life together that is public and invitational. And I don't know how to
Mm,
do that outside
yeah.
of a livable area where our friends and our
Yeah.
neighbors can actually see our life together and our individual
Yes.
lives and our lives as a family. But I think what's most power is that sense of collective discipleship where you can, I
Yes.
mean, where you can see our lives and especially over the long haul. So absolutely. Now, that that is it's a longer road in some ways
Mm,
to
yeah.
begin that way. And maybe it's not for everyone, but absolutely. Last thing on this, Dan, this is really, really important. And it's become kind of a clarion call for a lot of the folks that have been connected to the Parish Collective over the years.
Mm,
And I'm curious about your response on this with the task of church planting. And that is, as the church has been declining for a long time numerically, it makes sense that there's more and more anxiety in kind of our collective system, that it makes sense that we would ask questions about survival and how do we grow and how do we make it. Those are fair questions, maybe even obvious ones. But what I've sensed for quite some time is that when you ask yourself the church question, or you could say for church planters, like the church worship question, you tend to get those kinds of answers and you try to build
sure.
systems around them.
Right.
And that's a different pathway than starting with the
Right.
question of what is God up to? How do I join in that? What does it mean for us to be disciples pursuing that dream of God or that
Yes.
mission of God in this place. And in that way, you have to discern what does it mean for us to be and become the church. But
Right.
I think the questions that we fundamentally both start with and then keep asking are
Yeah.
huge, huge.
Yes.
So if folks listening in today are like, yeah, we want to be the church, like we want to join in God's renewal, we know that if we could be the church and be connected with others, like there's nothing that couldn't be transformed and restored and
Right.
liberated. There's no person, there's no system, there's no sector, there's nothing that like that's what we want to be about.
Mm,
Well, since we're limited in our bodies in real places, I think that's the best place to begin. What are the
yes.
hopes and dreams of God in this place? What is the story of this place? Who is here? What are the assets? What are the
Yes.
needs? All those questions. And let that question determine, in a lot of ways,
Yes.
our life together. It makes sense to try and say, well, how do we like grow the church or how do we get a church off the ground or, those kinds of things. But in my experience, and I've been in a lot of neighborhoods, um, the church service, while really important, I really believe it's important, doesn't automatically
Yes.
frame and shape us into becoming kind of a living, breathing
Yeah.
public way of life
Yeah.
together in the neighborhood
Yeah.
or in the parish.
Tim, we like to in V3 we like to use uh kind of a metaphor of the Fitbit versus the scale. So if you want to lose weight, uh, there's a typical approach, which is to get on the scale every morning and to see if your weight goes down. And every time the weight goes down, you think, yay, I'm reaching my goal. But the scale doesn't actually tell you if you're healthy. And so, you can starve yourself and
Love that.
be unhealthy and lose weight. And the scale will say, you're doing good, Dan. You're doing good. Um, versus a Fitbit or another measuring system around health that tells you how much you're walking, what your blood pressure is, how high your sugar levels are. Um, our measuring tools have a lot to do with what direction we headed, and so we use that metaphor to explain that if you start with the question, how does the church survive and start a worship gathering and grow, it's like getting on a scale and thinking you're healthy because you're losing weight
So
because you're
good.
just seeing some numbers. And
Yes.
it doesn't necessarily mean you're healthy. And when we're talking about health, we're talking about faithful presence in a particular place with a particular people, discerning the presence of God, right? And that's a measurement of health is how that's going. And that you don't have to ask that set of questions um, with the first measurement tool. And so what you're getting at, Tim, is really important. Our questions determine the path that we go on. And there is a natural reflex that when the church is, um, seemingly dying, I don't know, that's probably not the best way to phrase it, but hemorrhaging and losing people and up against the ropes when it comes to its viability in a society. Um, we naturally think about how to start new ones that attract new people, um and so I get that reflex. I get that
Hmm.
felt need that's there. But what you're advocating is, and you said this in between the lines, is a slower, more patient, more attuned pathway. And that does press up against, we haven't really got into church planting yet, but that does press up against the church planting impulse. In a lot of planters, whether you use the language of planting or not, starting,
Hmm.
organizing, but you're trying to break open space for something new to happen, it does press up against that impulse, the apostolic entrepreneurial speed, efficiency, need to get a viable product within a
Yep.
really quick amount of time. It does press up against that.
It does.
uh, share with me a little bit, Tim, of like the challenges that you see and have heard, or maybe some of the challenges people offered you against this parish approach to being the church.
Well, I so appreciate that. And I just want to say, I think we need lots and lots and lots more churches planted
Mm,
myself. And I don't think that that just happens accidentally. And I do think
sure.
there is like entrepreneurial, catalytic, apostolic, organizing vision and momentum. I don't think it's going to happen accidentally.
Yes.
And I think that the time horizon, and this butts up against larger systems of denominations and funding and um, teams and things like that that we can talk about. But
Right.
in my opinion, going the route of asking the question of what God is up to in the neighborhood and building small teams around that and having those get bigger and bigger, hopefully,
Yes.
is a really critical path. I don't think it's fast, but with the potential of time, meaning month over month, year over year, and really year over year,
Yes.
and potentially decade over decade, the compound interest of presence we
Mm,
almost never think about.
right.
Einstein said that compound interest is like the eighth wonder of the world. It's hard for us as human beings to like wrap our minds around how powerful it is.
Mm,
But like I love talking about this. I have nothing to do with it except for I love being there and um, seeing the kind of miracles that God did. But about 15 miles from, not even 10 miles from where I'm at right now in Chicago, is a neighborhood called North Lawndale, where some of you might even know Jonathan Brooks. He's our board chair at the Parish Collective, very dear friend, wrote a great book called Church Forsaken. And he's now the lead pastor at Lawndale Community Church, planted 40 years ago
mm,
by a bunch of 20-year-olds, honestly.
mm,
And they're kind of a unique unicorn in some ways. But this was a non denominational church plant that started 40 years ago with very little help. No big denomination, no huge amount of funding. Fundamentally, they're asking these questions. If you walk up and down Ogden Avenue now in Lawndale, you'll walk by Lawndale Health Center, which employs 700 people. You'll go by an area for aquaponics and urban agriculture. You'll walk by the hip hop center that the church started. You'll go by the legal center the church started. You'll go by the chapel that's connected to Northern Seminary. You can walk for 9 blocks
mm.
and see and just with befuddled amazement what this small ragtag crew did over 40 years. Now, that probably hasn't happened everywhere, but I don't think that it should be seen as like so astonishing. 40 years of
Sure.
faithful presence in a place, uh, those kinds of things can happen. And it is
Right.
beautiful. It is miraculous. And
Mm,
they're asking questions about their next chapters right now. Jonathan is leading them in that. But those kinds of stories, I would love to see
yeah.
more and more common. And so were those first 3 years hard? I'm sure they were. Maybe the first decade or two. And not they're
Yeah.
not hard now in some ways, but like
Mm,
compound interest is a power that as churches we need to wrestle through. Um,
yes.
so I think we need a lot more churches, and the more that
Yeah.
the longer time horizon that we can possibly structure for, the better, in my opinion.
Okay.
So be thinking
So do you,
5 years, 10 years, if at all possible.
right. So Tim, yeah, what you're saying there, are you the the goal? I mean, it's a bit of setting the terms of of why we're here, how long it's going to take. Um, Maybe that's not what you're scratching at, but in typical church planning approaches, um, the lead up is the metric is within, there's you blitz you canvas the community with advertisements, you have
Hmm.
preview services,
Hmm.
and then you launch in 9 months to 18 months your public gathering, right? That's the primary opening metric, that tells people, okay, this is what the commitment is. Do you want to get on board with this? Um, how do you how do you frame what the commitment is? What I mean, I'm using the word commitment, but like what am I attaching to, and what is the requirement, or like, well, how am I going to feel this in my life when it comes to where we're going together?
Redirect me if I'm
I
off
don't
on
mean
this,
that
but
as a consumer. I don't mean that necessarily as a consumer question, although it
no, no.
could be engaged that way. But
What I
everyone's
hear,
always
Dan, is
asking that, yeah,
yeah, it's a really crucial question in some ways to how. I mean, I know that V3 hasn't taken this approach at all. I did write about this a little bit, I think, in Every You Look, but some of you all might
yeah,
know dear friend Mark Scandrette, who's been in San Francisco for about
mm,
20 years, which he has told me stories for years about that exact proposal and imagination for how to plant churches in San Francisco, often well funded.
yes,
Um, Usually there's like teams of people that come every year to San Francisco. Maybe this is not true anymore, but like 4 or 5 a year, often with 1 million each or something like that. And what happens is they compete for the market share of attention of,
mm,
be brutally honest, like Christian undergraduates. And
mhm,
then, one of them makes it, meaning like they got the service up. They're the new show in town. Like they're the new cool thing. And they've got a great website, or their service is very particular to meet a need or whatever. And so it then kind of in some ways props up that story that this is still how you do things. What's not told
right,
is the four teams that moved from Texas or the Midwest or even just like whatever from LA who played that game, lost with spectacular
right,
pain, goes back home with their tails between their legs, asking really painful questions about God's call in their
right,
life. So
mm,
I feel like that you could say default to the canvassing and the show. It's
yeah,
easy to like um, see that it feels like it's working, but I would just contend I'm not sure that it is. So then the counter to that, which yeah, I got this from a conversation with you years ago, Dan. It is slower, and this would be my most fervent, I guess, prayer for those that are planting is to by any means ethically possible find a small team of people who could
yeah,
commit for at least 1 year to discerning some of these very simple, very fundamental questions.
yeah,
Um, how do we how do we discern what God's up to? How do we be the church in this neighborhood? How are we
yeah,
becoming the kinds of disciples of Jesus who could make other disciples of Jesus in this place?
yeah,
Um, I would take 4 or 5 families who could commit for 1 year with the imagination for 5
mm,
over 500 regional
right,
cultural Christians who consistently show up to a gathering on a Sunday.
yeah,
Because when you look at that through particular places and you look at through time, place and time arguably are the two portals to reality that we
right,
shirk away from.
yep,
But if they're embraced, they become powerful. I mean, these are not like you go back to the Lawndale story, it's powerful what has happened.
yes,
This is
yes,
not like a cute little like thing. Um,
yeah,
and so my prayer for everyone I know who's planting a church is, and I will like my email is tim@parishcollective.org. I will gladly pray for any of you that ask for this. Like for the initial team, who's the 3 or 4 or 5 that could go with you?
yeah,
Whether you're like, they're coming from
yeah,
your hometown, they're moving, they're already there. I don't, I've been at this long enough that I wouldn't care. Just anybody that's like relatively spiritually healthy, relatively emotionally healthy, uh, that core team
Yes.
creates the culture. As you
Yeah.
know, many of you that connected to V3 know, and V3 gets into this in a pretty specific way. But
Yeah.
I think that's underexplored in church planting
Yes.
circles. To me, it's
It is.
it's 80% of it, honestly.
It
And
is.
I've had my
Yeah.
own, I've tried to plant essentially two different churches, neither of which lasted. And most of my lament is for the first one, didn't realize that. And for the second
Mhm.
one, honestly, had a hard time finding people.
Mhm.
And so
Yes.
that's another reason why I feel like as the body of Christ, capital B,
Right.
capital C, we need to figure out how do we help each other out? Like
Yeah.
we don't need 100 people. We
Right.
need a dozen tops to
Yeah.
start. But I
Right.
think it's got to be pretty clear. And
Yes.
the more that we could be encouraging each other, like sending people, receiving people,
Yes. Yes.
to me, that's how we could plant more churches that have
Yes.
the capacity to be resilient for decades and
Yes. And so
participate in unbelievable dreams of God.
that's good. Not to get all spiritual, Tim, but I mean that's just how Jesus did it.
Right.
So we and that we I don't like to always use the language. I don't like to use the language of technique, but there is a technique there. And tools can be used to harm or to build something beautiful. Like you have a hammer in your
Mm-hmm.
hand, you can
Yep.
bash someone's skull in, or you could build a beautiful house to live in. And that technique of gathering a whatever language you want to use in V3, we call it discipleship core, spiritual formation. Some people call it a neighborhood group, but a committed core of people who do want to go on a journey together to explore their life in God, their life with each other, and their life in the neighborhood. I mean, very, very simple, but really a formative journey together, committed to 1 to 3 years, is a technique, and that can be misused and abused. You can have
Sure.
cultic dynamics that happen in that space.
Yep.
You can have abuse of power, but I think it's actually an untried path for the most part. So we're, that that technique of starting with a foundational core and not just a task team. We're not talking about a doer team. We're talking about a team that's coming to live in proximity or already there in proximity to discern what God is doing is, you know, is it is 80%, Tim. I mean, we have some research within V3 that the church plants that fail or don't make it,
Mm-hmm.
9 times out of 10, it was because the mindset and imagination for planting was starting with a solo planter, was starting with
Yep.
their skills, their gift, their calling, their acumen, and so to move outside of that solo space into how do we build an attached team to each other, an attached team to the neighborhood, does slow things down because I mean, the
It does.
slogan, it's much easier to do it yourself,
Mm-hmm.
is there. And so to take more time, to feel less anxiety, that you have time to build. I mean, things move at the speed of relationship. I don't know who said that, but that's
Yes.
what we're talking about here is um, almost borderline as a non-negotiable with being able to establish a neighborhood church community or parish centered community. Like, I don't think you can do it without that. Um, and so, yeah, I'm glad that you pointed that out. That's really, really, it's a mistake a lot of us have made. It's also, there's also reality to it that it's difficult and finding those people and finding a level of maturity and health and togetherness is a challenge, but it's vital. So it does slow people down. We ask when you're a visionary or you're an entrepreneurial and you're ready to, you're ready to, it's go time. Um, to hear those words, let's slow down, is difficult at times. I have one last question for you, and then I want to open it up to some folks that have put some questions in the Q&A. So the we if we had this conversation, and we've actually had this conversation multiple times, but if we had this conversation, um, 10 years ago, we may not have been bumping up against the challenge of technology or the opportunity of technology.
Mhm.
Um, but we did have challenge. We had the concept of affinity based gathering, and so rather than orienting around a particular place, we would gather around our felt needs or our affinities. Church for mothers with toddlers, church for bikers, church for
Yep.
whatever, fill in the blank. And now we have people not necessarily seeing the need to gather in interpersonal presence in a particular place. They can have church with affinity with people online. I don't know what question I'm asking. I'm kind of just building a little bit of, there's a world here that is at play when it comes to whether people see it as viable to do the work, to move into close proximity, to be the church in the neighborhood. What do you tell me about what maybe your opinion or what you're seeing the rub is, or like what are some of the opportunities? I'm curious about how those things collide a little bit.
Dan, we could definitely spend another entire hour at least on
Sure.
this question. I have like 14 colliding thoughts.
Okay.
Where I guess I would begin is I believe, and maybe I'm in the minority here, but I kind of doubt it. Before we talk about technology, let's just go back to the question or propose the hypothesis that the practical imagination for what the church is, and even more importantly, what the church is for, is just fundamentally up for grabs right now, at least in
Mm,
Western countries.
mhm.
There is not a resonance, there is not consensus. Oh, yeah, of course, the church exists for blank. I mean, even on this V3 call, I bet if everyone filled in, the
Sure.
church exists for, we filled it in, everybody put in the chat. You don't even do that. But we wouldn't agree because it's up for grabs. So I guess what the conversation we've been having is the church exists to join in the hopes and dreams of God in the neighborhood, pursuing God's shalom and forming disciples who are pursuing that dream, and they're dependent on the Spirit to do it. And I mean, that's a very shorthand, of course, but
Yes.
if you go with that as this is the purpose of the church, the
Yeah.
telos, the reason, then I don't know how you can pursue that outside of real places with real people in real
Yeah.
time. So, in that sense, then technology should only be seen as a tool to facilitate that.
I see.
So, and I largely think that's not happening. Um, it's a whole long aside, but I guess it's still around. I don't have the stomach for it anymore. But like, I remember when Nextdoor came out like years ago. I was so excited
Mm,
about it. I mean,
mm,
has it done good? I'm sure it has, but largely, and I'm like a card carrying neighborhoodian. I was like so excited about it.
mm.
Like it hasn't done a lot.
Yeah.
Um, Even to build social capital. It has some, I'm
Right.
sure, and maybe that has to do with the business model or whatever. But I'm somewhat skeptical, not so much about technology itself. To be real honest, what I'm skeptical about is the business model underneath the vast majority of the technological tools that we use. You know that
Mm,
phrase like, if there is no price, you're the product. So like,
right. Right.
um, we just got to be really careful with that. I'm also, and
Yeah.
this is the other rabbit hole that's really important right now for our own formation and certainly our kids. I know we both have a shared kind of intellectual crush on Jonathan Haidt, and his new book on the anxious generation is just kind of
Mhm.
heartbreaking
Yeah.
and has made me more deeply cynical, particularly about these little supercomputers that we hold around in our pockets that most of Gen Z is
Yes.
understandably addicted to because that's what they were, when you put the business model of ad revenue and behavioral scientists with
Yeah.
supercomputers, um, you know,
Yes.
you're going to get what we have, which is levels of levels of depression and anxiety, deaths of despair that we've just frankly never seen before.
Yes. Thanks for poking at that. We could spend an hour there, Tim, but there's I'm bringing that up just a little bit because there's a whole new kind of seeker edge in church planning that is really either galvanizing around the next cutting edge is affinity based gathering or um, online church. And so I've wondered how the particular place of transformation in our neighborhoods weighs into that or doesn't. And I'm not sure that's always being considered. So thanks for thanks for talking about that, Tim. I got a question from a Q&A from Kathy, and she asked, how does parish idea play out when so many folks commute more than 20 minutes to work and maybe other activities? Let me ask that question again. How does the parish idea play out when so many folks commute more than 20
Mm-hmm.
minutes to work or maybe for other activities?
It's a fantastic question. Well, I would say that if you, first of all, they might commute, but they're still oftentimes living a good chunk of their life, at least from like 5 to 9, oftentimes in their neighborhoods, and are kind
Mhm.
of co-creating that place. And oftentimes the jobs they're commuting to also have an effect on where they're living. And in some
Yes.
ways, um, even that commute, of course, is somewhat formative. But I think that it's a really important thing to wrestle with. But from my perspective, it's better to kind of like figure out how to have presence and then grow it from place to place. Then I feel like the only other realistic option is to be regional and hence get people to come to the gathering on Sunday to then disperse from there. However, I feel like we've seen where that story largely goes.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
and so it is a real challenge, but
Yes.
I feel like that's it. I still would kind of double down on neighborhood presence with an important caveat that we haven't talked about a lot. And that is, and it's a little bit less important initially for church planting, but I think it's powerfully underestimated for the kind of church capital C. And that is what's the what are the peers? What are the learning communities? What are the colleagues that you have, whether you're a pastor or not, a part of a neighborhood church or not, with other neighborhood churches across the city? Because
Mhm.
as we become more and more of a living, breathing network, that usually is where we can, in some ways, begin to match the social capital of the city,
Right.
which I think has a kind of power that is so profoundly untapped that it's hard to even fathom.
Mm.
Like, if this is a big part of why the parish collective exists, if there was even one kind of solid parish church, neighborhood church, they wave the flag saying we care a lot about this place. Of
Yes.
course, you can all come wherever you
Yes.
want, but like, it's not exclusive necessarily, but like, we really care about this neighborhood.
Yes.
As that neighborhood church is then in relationship in wisdom and discerning on their own blind spots with other neighborhood churches across the city, across the region, across the
Yes.
country,
Yeah.
That's stunning. And
Yes.
so, and what we've seen in the neighbor with Parish Collective is like loving God and loving actual neighbors and neighborhoods is really hard. It's very complex.
Yeah.
And it
Yes.
tends to subvert a lot of the ideologies and differences that keep us apart.
It
And
does.
so
Yeah.
the network side of things, even though particularly in a church plant, you don't have capacity to like meet every other church in town or but like please carve out whatever you think you
Yes.
can do, 5%, 10%, just to be friendly with other churches that you think especially care about the neighborhood because you'll learn from each other.
Right. Yes.
And that is a way to like go in some ways upstream from the rapid mobility in most of our cities. If we
Yeah.
could weave that together, literally like one church in every neighborhood, and they could connect,
Right.
we can't fathom what God would do with that.
Yeah. Tim, we did some research on this as well, and the two primary factors why an upstart community doesn't make it. One was the
Mm-hmm.
first one we mentioned was it was formed around a solo planter. The second one was that it became disconnected or untethered from a larger network of communities. So they began to
Yes.
like plant in isolation or exist in isolation. Um, and some of the reasons why that happens, some are kind of ugly and some are, you know, fairly natural. But some of the ugly reasons are nobody's doing church like us, and so
Yes.
we see that a lot in incarnational
Yes.
neighborhood expressions is that there's a sense that no one's doing it like us. So you can begin to think that you don't really need relationship or connection, or even like deep tethering with
Yes.
plants that have a variation of difference from you. And that's, and so there's a level of self-righteousness there that happens that ultimately it kills a community because you're alone. You're going to hit some hurdles and some hard times and that you don't foresee. And if you're untethered, um, it's easy to collapse. Another reason we see that is when people move away from their outside of their denomination for various reasons, which is good for some. My
Mm-hmm.
denomination will not allow me to plant because I'm a woman, or my
Mm-hmm.
denomination has a theological belief that is too exclusive. So you find yourself outside of an institution, um, which has permitted you to plant, but now you're in some ways not. You're homeless, and wandering, and so that impulse to break free has freed you up, but it hasn't necessarily rooted you and grounded you, and so that's why it's really really important to find, connect, to tether, whether it's building your own network or networking with one that's already there. Um, and I don't mean just swapping ideas, but this is where you find companionship
Yeah.
and deep solidarity and support. And so that was a secondary reason most any plant that failed was because of that. They become untethered over time. Um, so thanks for sharing those, Tim. I'm really encouraged by that. We have time for one more question, and it is, where is it? It's a good question. V3 hasn't gotten back to me yet, and I've tried to connect with them. So how do I join a cohort? So Arlene asked that question. Thanks for that, Arlene. You can email me directly at dan@the v3movement.org, dan@the v3movement.org, and I'll make sure you're taken care of and are able to connect for joining a cohort. And sorry that no one got back to you. Um, Tim, my last question is, do you feel, where are you on the scale of hopefulness versus discouragement about the future of the church? and you can be honest where you feel hopeful and where you feel discouraged. But like, where's your pulse on where you're feeling right now? I mean, we're in the midst of a significant shift of deconstruction. We're kind of divided politically, not kind of. We're exceptionally divided politically. We see lots of moral failure from the stage. Um,
Yep.
where are you with sensing like, is this worth it? I know you opened up with the church as the hope of the world, but where do you feel encouraged? Where do you feel discouraged or not?
I mean, briefly,
Yeah,
yeah, when you read the newspaper, when you see stuff online, when you hear reports of decline, it feels like an absolute meltdown.
right.
But I've been in five, 600 neighborhoods, and every time I have, I've always asked what has got up to here. And there's
Yes.
never, ever, ever been a time that I wasn't inspired. So
Hmm.
if we zoom down to the neighborhood level,
Yes.
it it feels much more like a movement. And
Yes.
those two things are connected, a meltdown and a movement. But I mean, this might sound a bit Sunday school cliched. Jesus Christ is going to build his church.
Hmm.
The gates of hell and despair and corruption and violence and injustice will not prevail.
Right.
And we don't even have to build it. We get to.
Right.
We get to. And so I'm profoundly hopeful about that because at the end, and this is maybe a good place to end, the task of planting a church is backbreaking work and of high calling. It's also a gift.
Hmm.
And at the end, the transformation that we seek is what God is actually doing.
Yeah.
We can't make it happen on our own. It's still grace. It's
Yeah.
actually all grace. So
Yeah.
no, I'm hopeful about that, even though I think the challenges are very real.
Yes. Thanks, Tim. So glad to chat with you and to work it out. Um, I'm inspired just with the chat, and I wish we could go another hour. Thank you. For those
Same,
who
always a gift.
are yeah, Tim, we need to talk more about this. For those who are listening in, a replay will be sent out to you of this, and you can share it widely, as well as if you're still interested or curious about a V3 cohort. You can go to the v3movement.org and check out. We're starting up another one in a couple months, so applications are open. Peace to you and have a beautiful day in your place.
Bye, everybody.